So my mum used to get these really scary phone calls at night. It was always when my dad was away too for work, like the caller somehow knew that he was gone. The first time he called, I answered the phone. All I heard at first was heavy breathing, and then, as I was about to hang up, a deep voice told me to put my mum on the phone. It scared me. The voice was deep and guttural, almost like a growl, and I ran and got her scared half to death. Naturally, she was upset that someone was calling after 8 p.m, which was a no-no in my house. Since everyone knew this too, she thought that it might be about my dad, who was in the Air Force. He was out on an assignment and wasn't allowed to say where he was going or what he was doing, so she took the first of many calls. Here's how it went.
Hello? Who is this? You want to find out? This isn't funny, okay? I'm hanging up now. Don't call back.
And she hung up. The phone rings again.
Hello? I can see you, you know. Oh yeah? Tell me what I'm wearing then. Well, you're wearing a black t-shirt and white underwear with black stripes. I'm calling the cops.
And then she hung up again.
911, what's the emergency? Yes, there's a strange man who keeps calling us, and he said that he could see me and even told me what I was wearing. He even told me what my underwear looked like. I have 3 kids at the home, and my husband is away in the Air Force. Can you please send an officer quickly? Of course, ma'am, but make sure all the windows and the doors are locked until a unit can get there, please. And stay away from them unless the officers are there. Okay, thank you.
And then they both hung up. We all make sure that everything is closed and locked, and then the phone rings again.
Hello? The cops won't be able to help you. No one can help you. You're mine. Excuse me? No, I am most certainly not yours, you psycho. Stop calling me.
And then she hung up. The phone did ring a couple of times after this, but we didn't answer again after that. The next day we had our phone number changed, and it still didn't stop him. In fact, it got worse and worse, to the point that we didn't leave the house much, and the phone was off the hook except for a scheduled random time that my dad would pick to call every day that he was away. But then, someone actually saw him. We never did, mind you, but the teenage boy in our neighborhood saw a man climbing the telephone pole that was 3 houses away, and almost diagonal to ours. That's why we knew how he called us and how he could see us too. He was tapping the phone and calling from that line, and when he was found, the teenage boys chased him because they knew our situation. After that, the caller never called back, thankfully, but 2 years later on America's Most Wanted, a woman with kids fitting the description of my mother was found raped and murdered. Her kids, family, and friends, they all said that she had been getting strange calls from a man that she couldn't keep from calling her, even though she had changed her phone number like 8 times in a year. And that somehow he knew everything about her and her family, even what they wore and who they talked to, and even when her husband was out of town, which was the only time that she got the calls. My mother called the tip line, and we never actually knew if they caught him or not, but man, was it similar to our situation. When I was a kid, my parents and I lived in a small mobile home in a plot that was across the street from the local cemetery. Although I don't remember much about living there, my parents and other family members have told me the stories. I do remember my dad and my mum arguing in the middle of the night one time. I remember my dad asking my mum, "Why are you washing the clothes at this hour of the night?" My mum arguing back that she wasn't, but we could hear the washer and the dryer running. I remember coming home and my parents freaking out because all the cabinets and the drawers were open. They assumed someone had broken into the house, but nothing was ever missing. I do remember one night, though, where multiple shadows entered my room and they were standing over my bed. I remember thinking it was my mum until, moments later, the lights turned on and my mum walked in to check on me. I was so freaked out that I never slept in my own bed again after that until I was about 9 years old. There's a scene in The Fourth Kind, too, that made me have a breakdown because it honestly felt like a flashback. And these are the things that I do remember. But the rest of this story was told to me by my parents, my grandparents, church pastor, and also there's a police report about it. So one night, my parents were outside having a few drinks and I was inside watching the TV. I must have been around 5 or 6 years old, but suddenly my parents heard me crying in pain and ran into the house to see what was happening. They saw me huddled over crying and screaming, and my mum ran over to me to start asking me what was wrong. She then lifted my shirt to see if something was biting me, and there was nothing, but my skin was being pulled in pinches as if it was rubber. My parents were panicking and they ran to get to the phone to call for help. But the moment my dad reached for the phone, the pinching stopped and the front door slammed open as if someone had just run out. My dad then ran outside to see if he could see anything, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, he started hearing a sort of growling coming from under the mobile home, and when he looked, all that he could see was some red bloodshot eyes staring at him and growing. My dad, in a complete panic, pulled out his gun and started shooting at whatever this thing was. This caught the attention of a police officer close by, who pulled up in front of the house and pulled his gun out on my dad. My dad quickly dropped his gun and told the officer, "Hey man, I'm sorry, but something just attacked my son and it's under the trailer." Before the officer could even look, a creature jumped out from under the mobile home, jumped the fence and started running. The police officer jumped back into his car and started chasing this thing, and at this point my parents were completely terrified. And since they had no car at the time, they called a friend of my dad's and asked them for a ride to my grandparents' house. Once my friend got there, my dad loaded us into the car and was getting ready to leave when the police officer returned. The police officer told my parents I followed that thing for about half a mile and then it just vanished. I don't know what it was, but I suggest that you leave the area for a time being in case it returns. My mum actually said that she had never heard a police officer sound so terrified in her life before. As we were driving down the road, my dad's friend looks at the rearview mirror and asks my parents, "Hey, do you guys see that thing running after us? What is that?" And at that point, the truck jumped as if something had just landed on the cargo bed. My mum started yelling in pain as the back of her hand was being pinched and pulled as my skin had been earlier. This continued too until my parents reached my grandparents' property. Now, my grandparents have always been super religious. They're one of the founding members of their church and used to host Sunday Mass at their home before the church had enough saved to buy a building and stuff. And the moment my mum walked into the front gate, the pinching and the pulling immediately stopped. My parents ran into my grandparents' home screaming and crying. My grandparents automatically assumed that my parents were either drunk or on some kind of a drug, but once they saw the look on all of their eyes, they decided to call the pastor immediately. As soon as the pastor arrived, their words were, "I don't know what's going on and I don't want to panic you, but I feel like something extremely hostile right outside of this home is sitting there." They immediately started praying. My mum says that she opened her eyes during the first prayer and looked outside the window, and she too could see those red bloodshot eyes staring into the house. That night, my mum also claims that during the middle of the night, she awoke and heard 3 knocks on the window. She said that she could see outside the window a tall creature walking back and forth right outside of the gate. She said that it was odd though, because it was almost as if the creature couldn't enter the property or something. After that night, things apparently calmed down and nothing ever really weird happened in that trailer again. Although my parents did move a few months later, but even the renters and the people who now live there claim that nothing has ever happened to them. But something is definitely there, and I think it remembers us. The reason why I say this is because my parents drove past one night and saw 3 dogs jump out from the cemetery and perch themselves like birds almost on the fence, watching the car drive by. I had my first ever car accident on the same street, in front of this cemetery too, and I just suddenly lost control of my car and crashed into a gas pipe, but I still can't explain how I lost control. My grandmother has unfortunately since passed and was buried in that cemetery too, and since then, thankfully, nothing has happened. I like to think that she's putting those creatures in their place, sort of acting as my guardian angel, but to be honest, who knows what the heck is happening. This happened years ago, and I haven't really shared it anywhere else, other than with other people around me when the supernatural topic comes up, but apart from that, I sort of keep it to myself. Now, I think I was about 12 at the time, and me and my two cousins, for reference, Garrett was also 12 and my cousin Jessa and her friend were both 14. Being the little stirrers that we were, whenever I would come up to visit, we always liked to sneak out of the house and go and get into all kind of shenanigans around the neighborhood, and tonight we were going to go gnoming. Basically, it's a modified version of a classic Nicky Nicky Nine Doors game, where we would knock on someone's door and see who could stand on the victim's lawn without moving for the longest. It's a pretty heavy wooded area along the coast, lots of wildlife too, so we started our journey around 10 p.m. I don't think any of us could muster the balls to do it because everyone's lights were off, and I guess we had some respect. But I remember the moon being super big that night, a great moon too. Also, I'm going to add here that there were a big series of lights on the water where you could see down the hill, but that could have just been one of the ferries for sure. Anyways, we continued up a hill towards a wooded area that we like to call the Witch's Forest. We had wild imaginations back then. Upon continuing about 200 meters away, 3 tall white figures walked out of the forest, and they almost looked like they had white robes on, but big black eyes in the middle and long bony hands. Immediately, too, we all felt this feeling of dread, and then an eerie silence overcame the entire area. I remember being frozen and all of us just sort of standing there not moving, wide-eyed and confused, when I suddenly jolted and grabbed my cousin Garrett's arm and yelled, "We need to leave now." My cousin, after giving his head a shake, came to his senses, but my cousin Jessa and her friend Diana were not responding, as if in some sort of state of shock or something. So, in the end, we just grabbed them and whipped them back by their arms, where they seemed to have come back from whatever trance that they were in. And we ran back extremely quickly. Upon turning the corner too and making it back to the house, the sound of the night came back too, which was really weird. I don't know what it was or if it was anything that we saw in the end, but it terrified me and my cousins for years. I don't think we slept that night too. I think we just stayed up talking about it all night. The feeling of just being totally out of control overcame us, I suppose, and I don't know how or why I was able to snap out of it, but I did, and I think I'm grateful for that. So I just moved not too long ago to a house on the other side of the city. I was barely even settled in when all of this happened. One of the first things I took care of was to get my home security up and running. I'm a very cautious person at the best of times because of things that have happened in the past, and I don't feel comfortable without cameras and motion detectors, etc. It was my second day in this house, as in actually living there with everything set up. I was at my desk, working on my newest Unreal Engine project, when I glanced at the monitor for my cameras, which showed a man standing in the street in front of my house. He was by my mailbox, and I watched for a minute as he would reach toward my box, then stop like he was hesitating and look up at my house. I found it odd, and I decided to go and see what was going on. I wasn't too concerned, as I own a pistol and had it with me. But by the time that I got out there, which wasn't very long, mind you, the guy was gone. He'd already crossed the street to the next block and was walking away pretty quickly. I didn't think too much of it. I really figured that he had the wrong house or something simple like that. I checked the mailbox too, just because of him being right there, and it was still empty. I very briefly entertained the notion that he'd placed something inside, maybe something grisly or frightening, but that was probably a result of me reading too much Stephen King. Anyway, it didn't take long for me to forget about the incident entirely and bury myself into my computer again. Hours passed, and before I knew it, it was midnight, and I decided it was time to go and relax, and I went down to lay on my couch and watch some TV. I would say, probably about 20 minutes later, I started hearing noises from outside. I pulled up my phone and checked my cameras, but there seemed to be nothing going on outside, and the motion detectors hadn't triggered, so I just went back to my show. I looked up just a while later, and I saw a man looking through my window, staring right at me. I yelled, "What the heck, man?" and jumped off the couch, grabbing my pistol off the table. He wasn't in the window anymore, so I went outside to the side of my house, and I didn't see him. I checked my entire property, and the man was now gone. The camera showed that he'd actually run into my backyard and hopped my fence into the alley, and he was pretty fast about it too. I realized that it was the man from earlier and wondered what the heck was going on. I debated filing a police report, but in the end I decided not to. I haven't had a wonderful experience in the past with law enforcement and tend to avoid it if I can. I did note at the time, though, that none of my motion sensors had triggered when this happened, and figured that they were probably not set up right. I didn't want to check them as it was early in the morning and dark, so I planned to do so later in the day. And I soon found that I had been wrong. I ended up dozing off on the couch, and I was awoken to the motion sensor alarm going off. I'm not a heavy sleeper, and it didn't take me long at all to respond. All in all, it was probably just a few seconds before I got outside, and it was, of course, this man again. He was running down the street in the same direction as the first time, too. But this time, I found something quite bothersome on the footage. The man hadn't even triggered the motion alarms. He'd been at my window looking in for like several minutes already by the time the alarm went off, apparently just watching me sleep. I don't know, but the alarm was triggered on the other side of my house by my neighbor's dog, of all things. And to this day, I still just don't have any answers. A neighbor of mine saw the footage and thought that it was the son of the house's former resident, who was known to be pretty unstable and disturbed. I did file a police report, and of course nothing ever came of it. They didn't even really waste much time or energy looking into it. In the end, I have no idea how he avoided triggering the motion sensors like that, or what he wanted from me. But I will tell you that I do keep my windows closed and curtains drawn from now on, because you never know who's watching. This story took place in Texas back in the fall of 1994. I was traveling from a small town outside of Dallas called Grapevine and was heading to my duty station. And I would never take this route again after what happened this night along the I-20. So I was traveling alone and had left at around 7 p.m. on my road trip across Texas. If you've ever been to Texas, then you know that you can drive for hours on end and still be in Texas. And this story would change my life forever. So I decided to stop at a rest stop along the highway to stretch my legs and take a piss. I noticed a woman in a late 70s model Ford parked in the lot when I got out. I went and did my business, had a smoke, and before I left I noticed the woman still sitting in her car. So I walked over and knocked on the window, which did startle her, and asked if she was okay or needed help. She smiled and said that her tire was flat, and that her battery had died while she was waiting here. I asked if she had a spare tire, and she said no. I asked if anyone was coming to get her, and she said that her daughter was supposed to, but it's been several hours of just her waiting there. I asked where she was going, and she told me the location, so I offered to give her a ride if she wanted. She actually started crying and said that this would be wonderful. So we started heading to the location, and we're making small talk. I told her that I was in the Air Force and heading to Lubbock. She said that that was wonderful and hoped that I really enjoyed it. I did notice, though, that she kept looking in the mirror, so I asked if she was okay with me giving her a ride. She smiled and said that everything was fine. She was just happy that somebody had stopped. We finally get to her house in a small suburb just outside of town. She thanks me for a ride and hands me a scrap of paper with a home number on it. And she asks that I call her when I get to my destination so she can know that I made it safely. I thanked her and said that I would, but I'd wait until the morning since I knew that it was going to be late when I arrived. I arrived at Reese AFB late that night and stayed at the on-base hotel. I got checked in and took a shower, and eventually I just went to bed.
The next morning I got up and I got dressed for the day and went to find my unit HQ. I didn't even think about the night before because I had so much to do, checking squared away and whatnot, and it wouldn't be for another 2 weeks before I came across that scrap of paper with the number. I kind of felt bad that I hadn't kept my promise to call, so I decided to stop what I was doing and just give her a call. I called the number and a young woman answered the phone, so I asked for Sandy. The woman on the line said, "Who?" So I apologized and said maybe it was Sandra. She asked who this was, and I gave her my name and explained that I had given her a ride a couple of weeks back. She said that I must be confused, and I read the number off of the paper in my hand just in case I dialed the wrong number. She said no, I had the correct number, but I couldn't give her mother a ride home because she had passed away in the early 80s. She was apparently driving home and began having car troubles, so she stopped at a rest stop just outside of town. When she didn't make it home, her father became concerned, and it was at that time that there was a knock on their door, and 2 state troopers and local police officers were at the door. She said that a trooper saw the vehicle stopped at the rest stop and stopped to check it out. What he found and what she told me gave me chills. Her mother had been brutally sexually assaulted, and her head was completely bashed in. Someone had slid her tires and disconnected her battery, and the worst part was that she didn't die right away, as there was bloody handprints on the window, steering wheel and shifter, because she was trying to leave. The trooper said that they didn't have any suspects, but there were times that certain motorcycle clubs would pass through at night. I described the car and what her mother looked like and what she was wearing as best as I could recall. She definitely didn't look old enough to have a daughter my age, but her daughter just started crying and asked that I not call back. A few days later, though, I received word to report to the squadron commander, so I headed over to our building. When I arrived, my captain called me into his office and began asking me questions about where I lived and when did I drive in and what route I took. I immediately knew that something was wrong, and we then went into a briefing room where my CO and Texas Ranger and a state trooper were seated. I introduced myself and I took a seat. They began by asking the same questions my captain had previously asked and why I had called the number and spoke with the woman. I explained everything as clearly and in detail as possible. They then finished taking notes and the ranger asked who needed a smoke. So my CO excused himself and the captain, the 2 officers and myself stepped out back to the smoking area. And this was when the ranger informed me that he was the actual trooper who had found the car back in the early 80s, and that the only reason he came out today was because of the details that I mentioned in my phone call to the daughter. The trooper said that they do get calls about a stranded woman every so often, but when they get there, they never find anything. So, in closing, I guess you need to be careful who you decide to help because not everyone is what they seem. I'd like to state too that the reason specific time frames are not given is due to the personal nature of some of these events. But I can assure you that everything I've told you is true. So, this happened years and years ago, and I was young, but I've asked my grandma about this incident recently. My grandma is a big road rager and likes to cuss and flip off and pull around people all the time. It's gotten better in her later years, but this was in 2014, I think. My grandma didn't tell my grandpa and I this story until it actually happened. So before we get into that though, here's some background about how I knew the mum and the kids. The mum was really sweet, and I was in her son's class in elementary, and I walked past her all the time on the way to the buses while she was waiting for my classmate. I also had daycare with all 3 of the kids, and I can't say that I met her boyfriend or ever saw him since I was young and I was in my own world playing with friends, but once in a while, just walking past her, she asked if I knew where my classmate was since he was running late, and I stood next to her and played with the youngest while she waited until I almost missed the bus. Anyway, back to the incident. So, my grandma is a big road rager, and on her way back from work mostly because of rush hour, she was going around a roundabout, about the only one in our town and pretty new, and a car behind her kept honking and riding on her bumper. She finally got sick of it because she was focused on trying to get around this new roundabout while having someone on her bumper, and honked her horn for a few seconds while at a stop and flipped the car off. She watches this guy in the mirror as he gets out of the car and cracks his knuckles while speed walking up to her. He's cussing her out, and she recognized the look on his face from past incidences with not too nice men. She was on her own though, and her car required her to manually lock the doors and trunk and roll up her window. She basically said, "Screw this," and sped around the stopped cars in front of her, which was really dangerous because of just how narrow it was, and just got off the roundabout. A month later though, they're watching the news while I'm in my room, and my grandparents start talking. It was a small house and I could hear them at least muttering. My grandpa yells for me, so I get up and I go back to the room. "Hey, don't you know little Johnny from school?" my grandpa asked, and I nodded, feeling confused and wondering if something happened to him. My grandpa plays the news story and he says, "Do you know his mum?" And the news told the whole story of how the man strangled her to death and posted the pictures on 4chan and the caption that, "If you don't believe me, watch the Washington News Channel at about so-and-so hours. Her son will be home then." It was the oldest son that discovered her nude and dead, and I had a few interactions with him before because of daycare and whatnot, and honestly, my entire heart just hurts thinking about it. My grandma sat up when they showed the boyfriend's face, and she realized it. That was the man in the car behind her. And I mean, he even looked recognizable to me as well, probably because it's just a small town, and I may have seen him at some stage. But she told us the whole story, and even just thinking about it sent shivers up my spine. He could have been slowly breaking just then, and that's why he raged out like he did. I'm just really happy that my grandma got out of that roundabout when she did. I'm not saying that he would have killed her or anything like that, just that he was already a woman beater and dangerous, so who's to say that he wouldn't have at least hurt her? I did talk to all three boys at one point or another that year when I would find their Instagrams. I don't think that I talked to the eldest though, but I tried to get in contact with just no luck. My classmate really didn't want to talk about it, but I tried my best to console him out of doing stuff. I don't want to put in too much detail about the kids, just for respect for them. But the youngest ran a whole account for his mum and would post just about the same picture every time that he was missing her, and I think he even wrote a book about it, although he was only 8 at the time. I have no idea where they are 5 years later, but I don't think they're in PO anymore. But let me finish by saying this. The mum, she was really sweet, and her boys were good kids. None of them deserved it, and I hope that that guy rots in hell. So I was about 16 years old, and at that time, very interested in ghosts, paranormal things, and stuff like that. My mum is, I wouldn't say a medium or anything, but highly esoteric and can see things in and around other humans. For example, she can feel bad energies and also describe dead loved ones of her customers standing beside her perfectly. And if you want to hear stories of my mum, just let me know. But her being so sensitive of those things did wake my interest even more. So I went online and researched on ways to communicate with spirits and energies and whatnot, and found out a way to do so. I invited my sister and 2 of our neighbours' kids to help and watch. I didn't want to do that alone because of obvious reasons. But we waited for my mother to leave because she prohibited specifically to ever communicate with the other world. But we wrote letters and numbers and also yes and no on a paper, cropped them out and arranged them in a circle. Well, we basically crafted a Ouija board. We lowered the shutters in my room. Yes, we did that in my room, stupid I know, and lit candles and placed them in different places in my room. Me and my sister placed our hands on an upside-down drinking glass, and the neighbours' kids watched from the bed. The first few times they laughed and chuckled when we said phrases like, "Is someone here who wants to talk with us?" or "If you want to communicate, please do that." But after a few minutes, a few of the candles started to flicker, and I didn't think too much about it because, candles do flicker. But after some more time, some of them really started to freak me out. They started to look like someone trying to blow them out, in fact. You know, like when you want to blow out candles but don't use enough air, so you just blow the flame in one direction? They looked a lot like that. And then the glass started moving. I looked at my sister and she looked at me, simultaneously asking if the other one was pushing it. We both got really freaked out, so we took our hands off of the glass and that freaking thing moved all by itself. I got a panic attack and we all screamed and ran to my door to get out. We had actually closed it before we got in. In hindsight, it was a very stupid idea. But I pressed the handle of my door down, but it just didn't move. Not an inch. My sister and the neighbor kid started to help pressing it down, and we leaned on it with all of our body weight, all combined, but it just didn't move an inch. And then the candles started to go out, and we just screamed, and eventually it opened, and we ran into the kitchen in a corner, and we just huddled together and cried. After that, we eventually calmed down, and things kind of went back to normal. From that day on, I never slept well in that room too, because I just felt watched all the time, and my writing desk chair started moving on its own as well. I placed it under the desk, and the next morning it stood a good meter away from it. My mum also noticed that my room just didn't feel right, like something lurks inside of it, and asked me if I did something stupid. Eventually I told her, and she was furious, saying that I could have brought much more evil in our apartment than a spirit that amuses itself by disturbing us. She said a ritual in my room, saying a few phrases and putting a protective circle around it and smoking it out with sage and whatnot, and after that, I was never disturbed by it again. Nevertheless, though, I won't be doing that again.